Am I looming over you? Hello. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm transmitting. Um, Hello everyone. Tanse everyone. I can't see the room, so I'm hoping that this is working. Um, I'm speaking to, oh, there we go. Now I can see. I'm speaking to you today from what's now colonially known as Gibsons, little town of Gibsons across the water from you all, in Squamish territories. But actually, I was born and raised on the other side of the water throughout what's now called Metro Vancouver, throughout the territories of the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking people. And myself, on my mother's side, we come from Cree and Métis homelands, including Red River Métis settlement, St. Paul de Métis settlement, Lac La Biche, Edmonton, and places in between. And on my dad's side, he's a first generation of German immigrants. So growing up in Vancouver, working in Vancouver, all of my work has really been focused on learning what it means to live on someone else's territory, learning whose territory I'm on, what that means for my own connections to culture, to stories, to memories, to place, and learning my responsibilities. And it's an ongoing journey, but it's definitely been shaped by my work with the City of Vancouver, which first started when I got out of university in 2000. So I was the first Aboriginal Social Planner, although that's not an official position. It's just what I called myself. And also the first Indigenous Arts and Culture Planner in Cultural Services a couple of years ago. And then throughout that time, I'm also a filmmaker, and I've worked in various roles with the city and park board, um, with my own focus on upholding the rights of the local nations, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, throughout the city as a colonial system, and then also looking at Indigenous rights in general and within my own community and urban Indigenous community. So it's very complex. My own role has been, often within the colonial system, observing the colonial system, working with the local nations and the urban Indigenous community. Um, but I will say, I'm not in the heart of the grassroots community and all the incredible work that's been happening there. And also, I'm not, in the heart of all the incredible work that's happening in policy development that organizations like yourselves are doing. So I come at this from various angles, um, and I definitely am not here to suggest models, but I am here to share what I've witnessed in this work. I did also work on Vancouver's UNDRIP strategy and helping with that process and pulling that together. And then, you know, doing research and trying to help the city look at the next steps towards working with urban Indigenous communities, um, in recognition that that work hasn't really happened and needs to happen and be done, with care. But I will say that when I first started at the city back in 2000, my broad job description was to help build relationships with the Aboriginal community. And certainly at that time, from everyone that I worked with, um, the Aboriginal community was a very shallow, limited understanding that staff had. And it was a very pan-Indigenous view that staff had. And there really was no recognition of the rights and title holding nations whose territory the city is on. So there was a lot of work that had to be done first, from my understanding, to make sure that the city, took that very fundamental step of recognizing that it is a colonial institution on the lands of rights and title holding nations. So that was a long journey, and we definitely, have come to that point. And with the city, being a city of reconciliation and working on the UNDRIP strategy and so on. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to do. And my own experience as a kid growing up, my mom would often, we would go to the Friendship Center a lot, and I would say back then in the 80s there was a lot of organizing, of course, And it really did feel like we were all in it together. And it was people from the local nations, it was people from all different nations across these continents. Um, and so I kind of grew up with that sense of the teaching that I have recently had around being in the same canoe. And for me, that kind of guides my work around, and how do we look at that? I don't like the distinctions based approach term either sometimes in terms of the exclusions that can happen. I think there's the specificity that's really important in thinking about, the land-based rights of the rights and title holding nations, the governments of these lands, and those of us who come from other lands but also carry rights with us. And it is complex. And so in hearing some of the comments today and the questions and the pain and the determination that people are carrying, um, for me in the Vancouver case, I think so much of it is about how to bridge that, and how to bridge the fact that generations of Indigenous people on these lands have been building community, have been building systems of care, circles of care, have been, operating with knowledge that we have rights, that we carry rights, while meanwhile, the racism, the violence, the exclusion, the poverty and the disparities continue, and the lack of recognition of the rights of Indigenous people, no matter where you live, that also continues. So to me, it's sort of like, how do we get to that point where we can say, yeah, the city of Vancouver asserts itself as having jurisdiction over these lands, as being the government of these lands, when it actually, in my perspective, is not the legitimate government of the lands. It's, imposed itself, but that's where we're at. So how do we, there's shifts happening where they now recognize Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh as governments. So that is a profound shift. And then how do we start to recognize that urban Indigenous communities, as per Mesclatus and other ways that our rights are enshrined, also have rights to decision making, to good quality of life, and so on. So I just want to quickly share something that I found in my research. It's actually thanks to my mom, who worked with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs at a time. And so she has a lot of documents still that I have looked through. And one of them is a report from 1985, a report to council, the city council. And it was about urban native initiatives. And it was basically a recognition, so way back in 1985, that the city needs to have a strong commitment to establish Native issues as a high priority for city initiatives, and to suggest a strategy for beginning to implement this commitment. There was also the recognition in the disparity in quality of life between Natives and non-Natives. And it stated that although all three levels of government have, to some degree, acknowledged the needs of urban Natives, none have acknowledged responsibility for providing services, nor has there been a coordinated effort to share responsibility. In the absence of government undertaking the primary responsibility for the planning and implementation of services and programs specifically for urban Natives, has been left to Native organizations, which are, for the most part, without political power or adequate access to resources or funding. So I thought it was really interesting that even back then, first of all, there was that recognition of the disparities, and that the governments do have a responsibility, but there's been no real taking up responsibility or coordinating of that responsibility. And also recognition that the community, itself, urban Indigenous communities, have been doing that work, and they've been doing that work since people have been living in cities. In my research, I also couldn't find, so the proposal was to create a committee, and to also that the city create a strategy for action, and that they make it a priority, which to me just blew my mind that that was actually happening in 1985. But from all my research and the public record that I could find, nothing really came of that. There was then Expo, and then quite far right, or more right-leaning council came into power for a long time after that. And so then I joined in the year 2000, and definitely could see there wasn't much other than, grants and those kinds of things, but not a lot in that recognition. And primarily it's about that sense of responsibility. And so with the whole City of Reconciliation thing that Vancouver does, it's often talked about as a relationships of mutual respect, which is important, but that doesn't necessarily mean taking responsibility for the city's own role in displacement and perpetuating inequality and perpetuating racism and colonial violence. Like that part of the relationship, I have yet to see. I've seen it start to happen with the nations in that recognition that they are the governments of these lands and they have rights as such. And that foundational relationship has been really strong and growing. But even when talking about, the need to look at urban Indigenous engagement and how urban Indigenous people's rights and voices are included and respected, I still think there's a need for the city to take responsibility for its own role in contributing to that, and also not addressing the ongoing violence, in a very significant or coordinated way. And so that just sort of leaves us to today and the research that I was doing to help kind of provide the context for, there's all that jurisdictional wrangling I'm sure people have been talking about around, cities aren't really responsible for Indigenous people, and all that kind of shirking of responsibility. And so the fact that we have Mesquadis and we have other ways that the rights of urban Indigenous people have been recognized, we're at that stage now where it's like, okay, so what does that look like? What does it look like for urban Indigenous people to have systems of governance? That for many people, service providers aren't necessarily the way to do that. To have self-determination in an urban context, what does that look like? And from my perspective, since people already know, people have been working so hard, they know what the needs are, they know what the strengths are, they've been building community and all kinds of incredible initiatives. It's just the ongoing lack of resources and lack of recognition, and not enough space for urban Indigenous people to really enact those rights and do that work. So from my perspective, it's just really time for, of course, all three levels of government to pay up, but the city itself to take responsibility to basically support the work that's already being done, and how those circles of care and can be supported. And there's all kinds of examples, because it seems like there still needs to be this explanation of, like, actually urban Indigenous people also have rights. They may not be land-based rights as title holders, but we carry rights through this wherever we go. It's so nice to see that there's all this recognition through Mesquadis, through the Royal Commission, all kinds of different tables where there's been this recognition, but there hasn't really been any shift in that, and like really seriously addressing that urban Indigenous people have rights to self-determination and some form of governance. So I do have a bunch of research that we're looking at how to bring that out in a way that's more accessible, and it's really just kind of reviewing what's already out there to help remind people of these rights. I was really inspired by much of what I found, but one paper from 2022 that's part of the Urban Sub Working Group, as part of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ National Action Plan, where they said that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people carry our identity and connections with us. We have inherent rights that exist everywhere, and they identified a sort of priority basket of rights, which includes rights to culture, rights to health and wellness, right to safety and human security, rights to justice. And I know that for example, Rachel Watney, who's, taking on this work at the City of Vancouver, really understands this and really carries this, and is reaching out to community and really trying to bridge the colonial government and the diverse community of urban Indigenous people, and to build on what's already been done, to build on the knowledge and expertise, um, and the communities of care and circles of care that people have been creating for so long. But I just hope that there's a way to really take it to that next level of not just engagement or inclusion, but actually, systems of governance, systems of um, rights recognition, and what that can look like. And my personal vision or dream, I guess it's more of a dream, is that recognition that the local nations are the governments of these lands, and that, right now the city sort of facilitating this relationship, but, eventually the city really doesn't, it shouldn't be the one deciding, and, sort of like, oh, we'll recognize your rights, um, these rights that already exist. But it's the relationships between Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh and urban Indigenous people, and how that can happen and what that looks like. And that will take time. And there's so much work that needs to happen right now, and just, the recognition of the first peoples of these lands. But I do carry with me a vision that the late Leonard George had of what he called the Plaza of Nations, which would have been at a place called the Plaza of Nations, which would have been a space for his community, all the local three nations, for their work, for their cultural work, recognizing their place on these lands. But that would be a place for other people who are guests and visitors and, not from these lands, to also be able to connect to culture, share culture, build community, and do that work. And so the sort of vision of like who the host nations are, and that welcoming, and that relationship that's so beautiful, and continues to grow. And so in the case of Vancouver, I hope, we can see that start to happen, because unfortunately there has been this sense of like the host nations are getting more attention and funding, or the urban Indigenous people are getting more attention and funding, and it's all that colonial quagmire, that really we should be past that by now. We should really be having that support and that voice, and that that authority to be recognized as rights holders. And yeah, I'm hopeful for that happening as this healing work happens. And yeah, I'm happy to share some of my own experiences or learnings, but that's just the kind of things on the top of my mind right now. So hi.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamala. I'd also like to note that Kamala has, for the last couple of years, been supporting NUICC's Knowledge Hub, and has provided us with some research and written a report that was commissioned, or it was funded by the City of Vancouver, and it was in the information packages that were provided to everyone. So are there any questions for Kamala before we hear from Jonathan? We do have a question here, Kamala.
Thank you. Leona Brown again, Gitsan and Nishka. I'm curious in listening to your conversation around Vancouver, because I advocate politically as well, and independently. Would there be a way for the three nations to use the band governance system to pass a motion to say that they support the urban Indigenous, or identify us as urban Indigenous people, and kind of slip that through their workings of UNDRIP in the cities? I don't know if that's understandable.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful idea. And I don't know where the nations are at that way. I know when during the UNDRIP process, there was, discussion of the nations themselves sort of doing some of that outreach, but with the capacity, and it just wasn't feasible. But and then there was sort of this idea, well, the city, you have a big responsibility to address, the things that you haven't been addressing. But I do know that MVAC has been working towards having agreements with the three nations. So I think that's a beautiful vision to think about. I can't speak for where the nations are at in that sense, but I hear it so many times, like even in terms of helping the rest of us know like the protocols and what and how we can approach certain things when we're doing a project or we want to do ceremony or what that looks like. So I think those conversations need to happen. Yeah, but I don't know whether that would come from their councils or what it will take. I just think we will get there eventually. And you're right, it needs to happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Kamala. Are there any other questions for Kamala? Chelsea?
So we've got a question from online. This is from Alistair McPhee. Giving UNDRIP enforceable legal effect will be difficult. How do you think this can be accomplished?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the person to answer that. I think when it comes to the City of Vancouver, in terms of what the calls to action so far and the ones that were made, there is the recognition that there will be need for some legal review, because some of the actions, would mean a charter change. So Vancouver has a Vancouver charter. Again, I don't recognize like in the big picture that that it's really the real law of these lands, but that's where we're at. So there will need to be legal changes to the system. But all of the various calls to action are being looked at in terms of implementing them throughout the departments. So there's concrete ways that they are being enacted. But in terms of enforceable, I don't really know. I don't know what examples might relate to that. But it does, the lawyers are very involved in UNDRIP and reviewing things and thinking about how they can be implemented with the needed charter changes that might have to happen. And that, does coincide with the province and their UNDRIP work too, where they are looking at changing the Local Governments Act and the Vancouver Charter to, to put UNDRIP into play.